Hi there. Just starting to look at the second presentation or narrated PowerPoint in the balance of payment and exchange rate document. Basically, you're looking at, from your perspective, from your booklet, at the following page. And we're starting from here, and we're going to go through and look at 4 or 5 pages, the next 4 or 5 pages in the booklet. Okay, so if you remember, what we looked at originally was the different things that determine the exchange rate. Okay, and what we're going to be doing is looking at this in a bit more detail and looking at how that effectively causes the value of our currency to change. So without further ado, let's just, as a bit of a starting point, take a look at this information that's on the screen now. So basically, in terms of the currency trading in theory, we've got a situation where the UK exports or chooses to export goods and services to another country. That essentially creates demand for the pound. Okay, so effectively we actually get individuals and businesses importing our goods, we export to them, and effectively, in order for, in this case, the USA to buy our goods and services, they have to convert their dollars into pounds, and that creates a demand for the pound. Okay. The opposite is true if we are importing. So, for instance, if we're importing oranges from Spain, from part of the European Union, that would effectively mean that we would, in order to buy those oranges, would have to convert our pounds, sell our pounds effectively into euros, or convert them into euros, and that essentially creates a supply to the forex or the foreign exchange market. Okay, and that principle is always what currency trading is all about. Okay, if there was no international trade, there wouldn't be a need for currency and exchange rates to be considered, but clearly in the international world that we live in, that's very much the case at the moment. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the things that determine the exchange rate, and this is a little bit revisionary, if you like. We've looked at this already, but it's just a nice summary. Okay, and we've got things that are going to affect the exchange rate based on the demand for the particular exchange rate, and also any change in the supply of that particular currency. Okay, we're always looking at essentially the difference between the value of one currency relative to another, and that's what we're looking at as far as exchange rate determinants are concerned. So if we take a look at demand in the first instance, then obviously if we get higher levels of exports for our goods and services, or in lower levels, that clearly is going to have an effect on the demand for our goods and services, and also the amount of currency that people will need to buy in order to purchase the exports in this instance. Okay, it's clearly going to be affected by changes in consumer income, also consumer confidence, and definitely preferences. Obviously, if there's a preference to buy goods and services from a particular country, that is then going to have an effect on the level of exports that we can achieve. We're also going to get some speculative purchases of currency. In some instances, currency investors, foreign exchange dealers will, in some cases, speculatively buy currencies with a view to buying them at a cheap rate and selling them at a more expensive rate and trying to make a profit as a result. So that clearly can have an effect on the demand for our currency. If we got inflows of foreign direct investment, shortened to FDI, that clearly is also going to have an effect on the demand for our pounds. We're also going to get some short-term capital flows where effectively that's known as hot money. Okay, so in some cases, in the short term, an organisation or an individual might actually choose to move their money or change their money from one currency into another, particularly when it's got something to do with the level of interest rates, the relative level of interest rate within a country. So if our interest rate is at a higher level than the country that the organisation is based in, or the individual is based in, they might choose to move their money from one currency into another, because clearly they are going to make more money based on the interest rate being higher in one country to another. And finally, things that can affect exchange rate in terms of demand. The demand side of the equation is intervention and purchases by the central bank. At the moment, the Bank of England is not doing that, but who knows, in the current scenario that we find ourselves in, that might well happen too. Let's take a look at the opposite side of the coin then. Okay, effectively in this instance, we've got import of goods and services. Okay, so if we've got higher levels of imports, that clearly is going to have an effect on the amount of money, amount of pounds in this case, that we are actually selling, i.e. we're using our pounds to buy the currency that we need to convert our pounds into in order to buy imports from that particular country. That obviously is going to then be affected by the same sorts of things as the export process. It's going to be affected by change in consumer income, changes in consumer confidence, and also preferences. We're also going to get some speculative selling of currency. So effectively, in some instances, an organisation or an individual or a foreign exchange dealer might choose to sell a currency because they believe that it's going to fall or another currency is going to be more of a higher rate in the future. So a little bit of speculation might happen there. Okay. If we then look at the outflows of foreign direct investment, if a foreign company or a foreign group have decided that they're going to move their investment out of the country, that outflow is going to cause a greater supply of pounds to the market, because effectively people will convert out of pounds into their own currency. We're also going to get some short-term capital flows. That could be hot money outflows as opposed to inflows, and that's again going to be related directly to the level of interest rates. And finally, we might actually get some intervention and selling of currencies that could affect both demand and supply. Okay, so that's a little bit of revision, but that's fundamentally the principles that we need to remember as far as exchange rate determination is concerned. Okay, let's move on. Let's have a look then at the way in which we might be able to represent this graphically. Okay, and this is a simple example of typical supply and demand diagram. And in this instance, what we're going to try to do is take a look at how the exchange rate and the equilibrium point is determined. Okay, so in this instance, if we're taking a look at this relatively simple diagram, we've got a supply and a demand curve for, in this instance, the number of pounds and so obviously the number of pounds that are supplied and the number of pounds that are demanded. Okay, and in this instance, we've got an equilibrium point at E1. So for quantity 1, we would be selling pounds at $1.65. Okay. In this instance then, okay, we're assuming this initial exchange rate is £1 to $1.65. But if we get a change in one of the factors that might affect demand, then if we've got rising incomes in the USA, let's assume that to be the case, that's going to mean that we're going to have higher levels of demand for UK products. So essentially, the USA are willing to import more goods. If that happens, then the US firms are going to need to buy more pounds in order to be able to convert their dollars into pounds and then buy our imported goods. And that would cause the demand for our pounds to rise as a result. So demand for pounds would move from D pound to D pound 1 or D sterling 1. So essentially move out to the right. So our demand curve. That's going to then create an initial shortage, okay, because there's a greater demand for pounds, and that will effectively be corrected by the price mechanism and essentially the exchange rate changing. So in this instance, we've got an initial shortage, but that is then effectively countered or changed by the equilibrium point moving to E2, quantity 3, and basically the increase in price, so that effectively our £1 now is worth $1.70. So the value of our pound relative to the dollar has actually increased. Okay, so if we take a look then at some of the other examples that we've got here, okay, so in this instance we're moving on to look at the tasks on page 5 in your booklet. So explain what will happen on the foreign exchange market in each scenario. I think these page numbers might be a little bit confused between the PowerPoint and the booklet, but basically you should be able to track that down. So it's that the heading on the page is changes to the equilibrium exchange rate, and you've got 3 tasks to do. Okay, what I'm going to do is get you to do those tasks. So you're going to try and draw up 3 examples of the supply and demand changes caused by, number 1, a rise in imports, number 2, a rise in inward investment, and number 3, a rise in exchange rates. So what I'd like you to do is stop the PowerPoint here, have a go at doing that, and then obviously when we come back and carry on with the presentation or the narrated PowerPoint, then clearly you can take a look at what the solutions are, and they build up from one step to another. Okay, so I'm going to give you some time to do that now. Okay, so welcome back, and we'll take a look at this change, a rise in imports, and how has that affected things. Okay, so in this instance then, if we've got a rise in imports, effectively what's going to happen is that rising consumer confidence, or this could be the reason for this, rising consumer confidence and rising consumer incomes lead to an increase in consumer spending and imports from the USA. Okay, so that's the scenario that we have in this situation. Okay, so in order to do that, in order to buy imports, UK firms need to actually exchange their pounds into, in this case, dollars. Okay, so the supply of pounds would rise. Essentially, we would be taking our pounds, selling them on the foreign exchange market to buy dollars. So effectively buying dollars with our pounds. Okay, that effectively would then increase the level of supply as a result. So the supply of pounds moves out to the right, and effectively there's an initial surplus. Obviously, anything where you've got a surplus is essentially going to affect your price, isn't it? So we've got more supply, then in some cases that is going to cause, in most cases, that's going to cause the value of the good or service, in this case our currency, to fall. Okay, so the rise in supply creates a surplus, and that's corrected by the exchange rate. The price mechanism effectively depreciates the value of the pound down to $1.50. Okay, so that new equilibrium point E2 effectively causing a change in the level of supply. If we take a look at the next point then, the rise in inward investment. In this instance, we've got FDI, foreign direct investment. We've got a change in demand for, in this case, the pound, haven't we? Okay, so if we've got this going on, if this is happening, that's essentially going to mean that we've got rising inward investment into the UK from the USA. We're taking the original equilibrium point at E1 at £1 to $1.65. But obviously when we've got foreign direct investment, the USA is going to have to buy pounds with their dollars, and effectively the demand for pounds is going to increase. It's going to move the demand curve out to the right. Again, the rising demand is going to create a shortage of pounds, and that's going to be corrected by the price mechanism, and that's going to mean that our value is going to change from £1 to $1.65 to £1 to $1.70, and that moves the new equilibrium point to E2. Okay, so those two essentially diametrically opposed in one sense. Okay, let's look at the third point then. So we're talking about a rise in interest rates, and in this instance we've got to bear in mind that that's going to have an effect on both curves. Okay, let's look at why that might happen. Okay, so again, starting point the same as the previous two situations, equilibrium point of E1, where at Q1 the quantity for pounds demanded basically is £1 to $1.65. Okay, so in this instance we got that same position, okay, but in this case the UK interest rates have increased. Okay, so that's going to mean that number one, that's going to be a greater incentive for UK consumers to save rather than to consume, and that essentially is going to effectively reduce the supply of pounds to purchase imports. Okay, we're not going to need so much of that to happen, because clearly people have chosen not to import, and businesses have chosen not to import because the demand isn't there for those particular goods and services. Okay, the other thing that would also happen, you need to bear in mind, is that if we've got an increase in interest rates, there is going to be a greater incentive for people in the US, for savers in the US, to put their money into UK banks through hot money flows, as we've called them previously. Okay, so in this instance we've got a shift of both curves. Okay, and in order for that to happen, well, that process means that the value of currency is going to increase significantly there. So in this instance, we're going to have two things that are causing upward pressure in terms of the value of the pound against the dollar. So we've got a greater demand for level of pounds, but also the supply of pounds has been significantly reduced by the fact that we've got this greater incentive to save as opposed to spend. So in this instance, although the quantity demanded stays the same at Q1, when those two scenarios happen, where we've got greater demand for our pounds, but actually less supply, that clearly is going to cause the value of our currency to increase significantly from £1 to $1.65 to £1 to $1.90. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense so far. What we're going to do next is to take a look at this in a little bit more detail and start to take the next step forward. Okay, so on page 9, or on page, just double check whether it is page 9, but it's the page following the one that we've just completed, and it's headed factors influencing the exchange rate. Okay, so you've got a situation here where you've got a whole range of different equilibrium points, all marked, and not only the equilibrium points, but also levels of supply and demand. Obviously, we've got S and D as the initial supply and demand curve, but then obviously we've got changes where we've got either an increase in the supply or a decrease in the supply, S1 or S2. I'd like you to take a look at the information that's been provided to you there, and also I'd like you to take a look and see if you can answer those questions. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different scenarios that I'd like you to consider, and in those scenarios I'd like you to think about where the equilibrium point would move to. Okay, so I'm going to give you some time to do that, and then once you've done that, also stop the PowerPoint, have a go at completing your booklet, and then we'll move on and look at the response, or the answers to that, once you've had a go at answering it yourself. Okay. So the answers then to these this scenario then, where we've got equilibrium, market in equilibrium, and then how those things, how the scenarios might impact that position. Okay, so let's take a look at the first question then. So remember, the diagram shows demand and supply of pounds on the foreign exchange market. Suppose that DNS are the original demand and supply curves, and then so at which point E to N is the market in equilibrium. So at that point, if we bear in mind that it's told us in the question that DNS are the original demand and supply curves, we know that at that point, the point where the market is in equilibrium is where point J is indicated, so where where supply equals demand. Okay, let's have a look at the next point then. So to which point will the market be most likely to move in the short term if there is, number one, an increase in exports? So bearing in mind it's where it's most likely to move, and also in the short term. Okay, so we take an increase in exports, it's going to move the equilibrium point to point L. So essentially our demand curve has moved out to the right because we've got an increase in the number of pounds that are required to pay for UK exports. Okay, so we've got a greater demand for pounds as a result. Let's take a look at the next point then, where we've got an increase in imports then. Okay, so in this instance, the supply of pounds, we've actually effectively sold more of our pounds. Okay, so we've sold them in order to buy, in this case, dollars, let's assume. So in this instance, that would mean that would move our equilibrium point to point N. So we effectively got greater supply of pounds, and that's going to then affect the overall value negatively, effectively, isn't it? Because we've so the value of our pound is going to become weaker. Point three, a fall in interest rates in the London money markets. Well, in this instance, if we get a fall in interest rates relative to other markets, that's going to mean effectively that the supply of pounds is going to increase because UK savings are going to be attracted abroad, and the demand for pounds is going to decrease. The savings are less likely to move to the UK, okay, because we've got this interest rate fall, okay. So that would be point E. If we take a look at 4.4, a rise in takeovers of US companies by British companies, well, if that happens, then effectively British companies are going to have to take their pounds and convert them into US dollars, and so effectively the supply of pounds is going to increase as pounds are exchanged for US dollars to buy US companies. So it's going to move the equilibrium point to point N. Okay, if we take a look at the next one, a belief that the value of the euro will rise in the near future, point 5, that is going to cause the equilibrium point to move to point E. Okay, and the reason for that is that we've got a supply of pounds increasing as speculators are likely to sell their pounds to buy foreign currency, and also we're going to get a demand for pounds decreasing because speculators are less likely to buy pounds and more likely to buy euros if they believe that the value of the euro is going to go up significantly. Okay, that's what speculators would be looking to do, to try and make more money from their currency dealings. Okay, let's have a look at the next one then. Point number 6, bad summer weather in the UK, which sharply increases the number of foreign holidays taken. If that's the case, that's going to move to point N, because effectively we're going to have the supply of pounds increasing, and that's going to mean the reason for that, UK tourists are exchanging pounds for foreign currency. So as and when, if we are ever able to go abroad, I'm sure that will happen in time, but not just at the moment, without it being pretty difficult to do so. So in this instance, that would cause the equilibrium point to move to point N. And finally, a discovery of a huge new oil field in the North Sea. Now, this is going to have quite an impact, and let's have a think about the reasons why that would be then. It's going to move to the point of equilibrium to point K. Okay, now there's two reasons in essence. So the reason for that is you're going to get demand for pounds is going to increase as more oil is exported from the UK, so more people are going to want to buy oil from us. Okay, that's going to mean they're going to have to convert their currency into pounds in order to buy. But also, if we get higher levels, if we get a huge new oil field, it's going to mean we're also going to have less oil imported. So that's going to effectively mean the supply of pound is going to decrease as less oil is imported. Okay, so again, when you're looking at these points of equilibrium, and when you first look at a supply and demand graph like that, you might think, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start. But if you just, again, simply think about it step by step and think about what are the implications of this scenario changing, then it's actually not too difficult a process to go through. Okay, so let's move on. Last couple of things I'd just like to look at, and then we'll stop. First things first, and it's something that we have looked at before, but it's a really good checkpoint whenever you're looking at trying to assess what a change in the value of a currency might have, what impact that might have. Okay, the first one that some would be familiar with is this SPICed principle. Okay, so it's an acronym which stands for stronger pound. So if we've got relative to another currency, if our pound is stronger, that's going to mean that our imports are going to be cheaper. When I say stronger, it's more valuable. And exports are going to be dearer or more expensive. Okay, so remember SPICed. So stronger pound, imports cheaper, exports dearer. Okay, there is another one to remember, which is sort of the opposite, but it's quite a nice one to sort of remember too, and that's WIPI-DEC. Okay, so that's in that instance, if we've got a weaker pound, if our pound isn't worth as much as it was previously relative to another currency, then imports are going to be dearer, more expensive, and exports are going to be cheaper. Okay, so that's going to have an impact on international trade. Clearly, if we've got exports relatively cheap, that's hopefully going to mean that demand for our exports is going to be higher as a result. So when we're analysing the impact of either a depreciation or an appreciation in currency use, try to remember SPICed and WIPI-DEC. Okay, SPICed standing for stronger pound, imports cheaper, exports dearer, more expensive, and WIPI-DEC weaker pound, imports dearer, exports cheaper. Okie dokie, we're going to stop there and we'll take a look at the next page where we're looking at exports and imports prices in the next video. Okay.